We looked at the facial veneer, which is shown here, and then we discussed the incisal butt. Today, we're going to extend this margin on the lingual, either here or maybe even all the way over to here. And I thought it would be good to review why it is that we wrap the veneers on the lingual, but also we want to wrap interproximally for aesthetic reasons in many cases. For diastema closures, it's critical that you wrap the burr interproximally because you'll be able to develop much better interproximal contours. Here's an example of a lingual wrap veneer on a patient that had very extensive diastemas. So why don't we go over a few of the reasons why we would want to perform a lingual wrap. Well, one is existing restorations. If there's an existing composite that's on the lingual, we'll definitely want to include that, as we learned in the previous video. If there's wear or defects on the lingual, enamel is missing, we don't want to leave the margin indented. We want to cover over the dentin and find an enamel margin. If there's a diastema, like we just mentioned, we want to make sure that we carry the preparation interproximally so that we can have adequate physiologic contours interproximally. If we have less than ideal enamel remaining on the tooth, wrapping onto the lingual, it's starting to give you some traditional resistance and retention form that can help this veneer be more stable. And clearly, if we had a previous veneer that we're replacing that had a wrap, we're going to have to maintain that same wrapped design. This is a patient of mine that came to me with significantly defective composite restorations. And when I removed them and prepared the veneers, it was obvious to me that this patient had probably had some diastema. So the preparations did wrap around interproximally. This is called a Geller model, and for technicians, this is the ultimate way to make veneers because that's refractory dye material. And the refractory dye material is removable, so the veneer can be baked directly on this material, and all of these little individual dyes can be removed from the master cast. And I think it's worthwhile to have your technician use this technique. Well, these are the feldspathic veneers that were made for the patient utilizing Vita porcelain, and they were performed very thin and very beautifully by my technician. You can see all the characterizations that were placed into the veneers, and we can take a look at the patient, how he was transformed from a rather unsightly composite restoration to a much better veneer. So let's get started, and we're going to use the SDS veneer preparation burr kit, and let's take a look inside. And we're probably going to be using the 379 and the 8379 for the lingual portion of this preparation, and the 379 is 100 micron grit, where the 8379 with the red stripe is only 30 micron grit. We're also going to be utilizing the LVS 3 and LVS 4 burrs as we have done in previous videos. This is the Vision Flex disc. We're going to be utilizing this for interproximal reduction. So here's the tooth we're going to work on. It has a diastema on the mesial and a chip on that mesial incisal corner, simulating something that we might see clinically. And when we look at this tooth from the incisal view, we're going to show you that I have also simulated some wear and defects on the lingual that would be very similar to what you would find clinically on patients that you'd want to include into the veneer, of course, after you've already diagnosed the reason for the wear. We're going to use the preoperative prep guide that was made from a diagnostic wax up, and you can see that there's already space for the veneer material. Not enough space, but some already existing, so our preparation may not be as aggressive in that area. We're going to use the LVS1 to give us 0.5 millimeter depth cuts, as we've done in previous videos. And we're also going to be utilizing this Vision Flex disc, which is going to have to be used very carefully. So let's get started. we finished the initial part of the facial reduction, and let's rotate this over a little bit so we can kind of see where we're headed. We're going to have to include that wear area, but let's turn our attention to the interproximal preparation first. And once again, the vision flex. If you are not using a good finger rest and have the lips protected, this can be a devastating mistake you can make by letting this slip out of your hands. So you want to be extremely careful with this particular disc, but it works really well. We're then going to switch over to the LVS4 because it's a little more narrow than the LVS3, and we're going to push through interproximally. And I want you to see how the burr is pushing straight back at one point here, and I'll show you that right there. And so you're pushing the burr back towards the back of the mouth, straight over this way. There may be an urge to turn the corner as though we were doing a crown preparation like this, but don't do that. So this is actually like a slice preparation. Okay, so after this is completed, let's turn our attention to the incisal reduction. We are going to use a 330 burr for this particular step, and we're going to make these little notches in here, and then we'll be able to produce the area between them. And as we've talked about in the past, we can use this diamond obliquely to remove any irregularities on that incisal area. That's a great trick for smoothing surfaces that have irregularities due to depth cuts. Having finished the incisal reduction, let's turn our attention to the lingual, and this is a 379-014, and it's 1.4 millimeters at its widest area, which means we can use about 2/3 of that to determine the proper reduction. In other words, about 1 millimeter. And you can just work your way across here, remembering that we must create space for the occlusion. So you have to have the patient close together and evaluate the clearance here, which should be approximately 1 millimeter. That will be enough thickness of the ceramic so that it will be very strong under compression and adequately strong during tensile forces. We can upright this burr now and start the margin, which is, in this case, the finish line is a shoulder with a rounded internal, and the burr is pretty good at doing that, so you can hold it upright. And while you still have the burr in the handpiece, you can go ahead and start the beveling procedure, bevel the sharp edges that you would have across that lingual incisal, and also you could even use it for the facial incisal. As well. So it's important to realize that we are going to need to make sure that this preparation has draw that moves slightly incisally rather than just facially or facial incisal, because the wrap is going to lock us in, and we want to look for areas that might be undercut as we view them from the line of draw that we're establishing. And this is going to necessitate a little bit more reduction of tooth structure than you would do in an incisal butt veneer, which is one of the reasons why I would perform lingual wraps only when they're indicated and not as a routine. So use the burr as you would on a full crown preparation, holding along the long axis of the preparation, and see how well it is leaning towards each other. So the little wall you create on the distal and that proximal wall have to draw together. And it's very easy to make these preparations with undercuts that make it nearly impossible for the technician to fabricate your veneers. So I find when I'm doing lingual wrap veneers that I'm spending a significant amount of time evaluating this line of draw. So we keep assessing and making small adjustments until the preparation meets the line of draw requirements. And it typically happens on the corners, and it happens in the interproximal areas where you'll need to make some modifications. So that's what I'm doing here. I'm just continuing to modify, utilizing a fine grit diamond to enhance the surface just a little bit. And then every once in a while, getting out an instrument or explorer or something, holding it down at the finish line, making sure I can see it, or if the instrument's being hidden or blocked out by the axial wall above it. So you can take a look. Here I'm going to point this out with my RGS instrument that we're still tight on that distal gingival corner relative to that mesial lingual corner, and we're going to need to make some modifications to this preparation in order to make it have an easy draw rather than a difficult draw that barely works. We want to spend a little bit of time really making this work well. One of the great ways you can get draw to improve is to focus your attention to the incisal third rather than the entire wall, because sometimes the problem is just up here at the incisal third and you don't have to prep the entire wall. So I'm just showing you that here with the 8850. Notice that you have a lot more reduction in proximal. Well, that was required. We need to do that in order to get a good finish line. But the reduction on the facial is quite typical for a veneer. So we continue to make the modifications, assessing, and we want to have a butt joint all the way around, or a shoulder with a rounded internal. You can see with the RGS2 it's not 0.75 millimeters, but it's somewhere between 0.4 and 0.75. Maybe it's a half millimeter or so right down in that marginal area. And that's approximately what you want to have on that lingual. This is the Vision Flex diamond strip, which will be used to create a little bit of space and also to remove loose enamel rods. And I think at this point, after utilizing the discs and the Jiffy Green, that we're pretty happy with the result. We want to try to make the margins as clean as possible and the surface as smooth as possible. And it's no problem having one veneer as a lingual wrap and another veneer right next to it as an incisal butt, and the one next to that being a facial only veneer. The ceramics can be managed quite well as long as it's all feldspathic. We run into problems matching things when we're trying to combine feldspathic on one tooth and Emax on another tooth. Anyway, this is the lingual wrap video, and stay tuned for super veneers, one of my favorite topics. Thanks for listening.